everybody. Thank you for having me out. I'll adjust the microphone down because I have to stand real tall. All right. I'm not paying attention to you. I do have slide notes here. I am from the Maritimes, and so we want to leave at some point tonight, so I use slide notes to keep myself from going far too long. So the title of my talk, Big Questions, Disappearing Data, the Late Maritime Woodland and the Impact of Erosion in the Wabanaki Homeland. There will be a little bit less about the Late Maritime Woodland than I had planned. When I pitched this talk, I was expecting a bunch of radiocarbon dates to come in, and they haven't arrived yet. And so there's the implications and the conclusions of my research are not as thrilling as they might be. And so I kind of shifted things a little bit to kind of share a little bit more about the work that I'm doing. And so, although we're meeting tonight on traditional Blackfoot territory, the data that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is based on research that's primarily focused on data from the Canadian Maritime provinces. And these areas lie within the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territories of the Wabanaki people, most specifically the territories of Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescota-Makati nations. And these territories are covered by treaties signed with the British Crown throughout the 1700s and the 18th century, called the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. And those treaties recognize Indigenous title to those lands. So in the intro, kind of got an overview of what my background is. I grew up in New Brunswick. I did my undergrad and my master's at UNB, my PhD at U of T, and much of my career was in the CRM industry, and so it's kind of shaped a lot of what I've done, and a lot of the data actually that is in the presentation tonight stems from projects that were excavated either through CRM contexts or in salvage kind of mitigation style excavations. And so I had the opportunity to work in Labrador, all throughout the Atlantic provinces, Southern Ontario, a stint in Northern BC, before landing in Lethbridge here. And so although I don't have any current field projects in Alberta, I'm working with my students on some stuff from Fort Calgary. And so if any of you have some insights into that, I'm going to pick your brains. I'm also a bit of a shameless self-promoter, and so I am the co-host of the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast. And so if you enjoy hearing about the Canadian Maritimes and New Brunswick archaeology tonight, I would encourage you to check out the podcast. And if you're interested, I have a bunch of stickers that I can give you at the end of the talk. So come find me, and I'll get you a sticker. So why the Late Woodland, or in this case, why the Late Maritime Woodland? I'm particularly interested in the Late Maritime Woodland and have been for a number of years and for a number of reasons. And so the first of these are a variety of changes that we see in the eastern part of North America, particularly up to and after around 1000 CE, so around 1000 years ago. And much of this has to do with economic intensification and settlement changes, much of which intersects with, in a lot of the eastern woodlands, the adoption of maize horticulture, so growing corn. And it speaks to the complex ways that the forager to farmer transition took place in North America. And so in the region that I work, though, where horticulture was not adopted, we see kind of a myriad of processes that appear to indicate, even in the absence of agriculture, there is considerable change going on. And so kind of interesting to think about that from the perspective of hunter, fisher, gatherers. The second is that how European contact changed Wabanaki lives. And so while contact out here in the plains was in the 19th century, on the East Coast it was beginning as early as the 15th century, maybe even earlier than that. If you use the Norse, it was actually probably around 1000, although the impact on the Wabanaki is probably pretty minor. But essentially, what we're looking at in particular are some of the processes that we see in place in the period leading up to European contact, among Wabanaki and between different indigenous groups, and how those change or are adapted into the post-contact period. This applies to, for example, where people are living, as in, so the locations where millennial occupations of Wolastoqiyik and Wabanaki, are they changing? Are they showing continuities? And this has implications in the modern context for both Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq nations involved in comprehensive land claims. And so it's about sort of building continuities in the landscape and in placing indigenous groups in those, back in their locations, or back where their heritages. And finally, this period is important due to threats imposed by climate change. And so this is adversely affecting earlier sites, climate changes. And so on the coasts of Atlantic Canada, for example, we have fairly strong evidence that the archaeological record is truncated at around 2,000 years ago. Whereas on the interior, where I tend to work, we have a sense that there are intact earlier sites, possibly deeply stratified. But the late maritime woodland and post-contact archaeology of the region, counterintuitively, are among the most shallow archaeological deposits and are actually likely the ones that have been, some of which have been destroyed over the last couple of hundred years due to development and are threatened now by increasing storm amplitude and intensity, alongside increasing intensity of, for example, the spring freshet along the river systems, and causing damage to riverine sites which contain thousands of years of information about Wabanaki people, including the poorly understood late maritime woodland and post-contact periods. So part of this is the shallow deposition of these sites means that they're subject to kinds of impacts. So for example, ice scouring in the winter, overturned trees and uprooting, that deeper sites might not be. As I'll talk about though, erosion is affecting everything. And so these are the kinds of grand challenges or big questions for North American archaeology, and in particular for the Atlantic Northeast, outlined by Keith Kintai and others, as well as more locally by Matthew Betts and Gabe Reineck in their Archaeology of the Atlantic Northeast. So, to give you some background, what is the Maritime Peninsula and why are we talking about it? So this is a cultural geographic area encompassing the Canadian Maritime provinces, the Bas-Saint-Laurent and Gaspésie regions of Quebec, parts of Maine, east of the Kennebec River in Maine, and so you can see here in the shaded gray area. This is also, although it encompasses a geographic area, the boundary of the region of the Maritime Peninsula is largely a construct of anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians. We tend to consider the Maritime Peninsula as the homeland of the Wabanaki people, or the people of the Dawnland. And so this is a group of Eastern Algonquian-speaking Indigenous peoples, including contemporary Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, Pescoda-Makati, Penobscot, and Abenaki people. The Wabanaki Confederacy was actually a political alliance that was formed in the 1700s to provide negotiating power for their 7 separate nations in discussions with Europeans, and to provide stability in dealing with other nations. So, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy of the Great Lakes. It dissolved in the mid to late 1800s, and there's a modern iteration that's come up since the 90s. However, we know that the Wabanaki Confederacy, although it wasn't capitalized as Wabanaki Confederacy, extended well into the pre-European period, as demonstrated by exchange relationships. So in the ethnographic record in New Brunswick, Wolastoqiyik traditional territories are located along the Wolastoq River, shown on your left, in the shaded area, and Pescoda-Makati in the Passamaquoddy Bay area of southwest New Brunswick, so in this area down here. Whether these were 2 separate populations in the past, or groups that moved seasonally from the coast to the interior, is not conclusively understood. They share a language, and the seasonal migration patterns of the coasts in the summer and interiors in the winter increasingly suggests that this is actually a pattern that was developed in the early contact period into the post-contact. Wolastoqiyik are highly mobile. They moved up and down the river over the course of the year in a series of short-term campsites. And as you saw in the previous slide, they built birch bark canoes. Susan Blair refers to Wolastoqiyik as the quintessential river dwellers, and the watercraft they perfected their watercraft for moving up and down the streams, rivers, and lakes that dot the Wolastoq. Ethnographic accounts describe Wolastoqiyik living in summer villages and dispersed winter settlements, and they had a seasonal round based on resource availability. Among the Mi'kmaq, traditional territories span the northeast and east coast of New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, and up into Quebec, as well as extending into Newfoundland in the post-contact period. These groups were also seasonal hunter, fisher, gatherers and followed a very similar seasonal cycle as Wolastoqiyik. Now the Lower Wolastoq, where I work, in this area here, in the circle, and the area around the Grand Lake Meadows has attracted archaeological research since the 19th century, with naturalists and avocational archaeologists remarking on the richness and density of sites in the area. This is where much of my work has taken place over the last 15 years, and what I'll mostly be talking about today. So, to give you some culture history and a little bit of background before I start talking about the Maritime Woodland, the Maritime Peninsula has a pre-contact record that extends back to the retreat of the glaciers. So we know that there's human occupation dating back to at least 12,600 years ago, but generally the Paleo-Indian period is referred to as between about 12,900 and 9,000 years ago. The Archaic period extends from around 9,000 to 3,000 years ago, and the Maritime Woodland from about 3,000 to 500 years ago, with the proto-Contact period taking place between about 600 and 400 years ago, or between about 1400 and 1604 CE. Now, 1604 onwards, we consider the historic period, and this is after Champlain's somewhat disastrous overwintering in St. Croix, and the following year, 1605, Port Royal is established in Nova Scotia, and you have Europeans overwintering and building permanent settlement in the Maritimes. So the New England Maritimes region experienced dramatic post-glacial processes, and while there's no evidence for human occupation prior to 13,000 years ago, you can see by about 14,000 years ago the area was largely ice-free. You'll recognize probably a lot of these projectile points as similar to what you see in the plains. And so you have fluted point Paleo-Indian groups from about 12,900 to about 11,600 years ago. And so at the onset of the Younger Dryas period, you have a shift from fluted point forms to unfluted point forms. And so the late Paleo-Indian period is characterized by the presence of these unfluted, still collaterally flanked lanceolate points, a number of which are reminiscent of forms like Plano, and more familiar out here, Agate Basin or Hell Gap style points, extending up to about 9,000 years ago. And in fact, we've been looking at this patterning. This is a time period that was actually very poorly understood. We had a recent paper that came out where we're talking about the connections. There's sort of a conversation going on in the Paleo-Indian world right now, looking at these shouldered and lanceolate late Paleo-Indian points. And so while these points are actually from legacy collections, we suggest that they indicate a much more extensive late Paleo-Indian period presence in New Brunswick. And so from 2 collections, there are 8 points, whereas previously there were only 4 documented late Paleo-Indian artifacts in all of the province. And so we suggest that there's actually some of the areas where I'm working in the Lower Wolastoq, where many of these artifacts are coming from, might be a location where we need to start looking for some of these sites. You see technological change in the Maritime Archaic with the adoption of heavy groundstone tools. This probably has to do with major environmental changes going on. You also see the introduction of stemmed and notched tools, much the same as what you see out here at the end of the Paleo-Indian period. And you have particular stone tool varieties, like for example the ones on the left, Stark Neville points from the early Archaic. These show connections with groups all the way down the Atlantic seaboard. So the Stark Neville type probably originates somewhere in the southeast or the mid-Atlantic. And we see over time those groups moving up into or interacting with groups on the east coast. Toward the end of the Archaic, you have, beginning about 5,200 years ago, specialized fisheries and fishery technologies kind of taking over. And at this point, you really see a truly maritime adaptation of groups on the east coast that is kind of a throughput through much of the successive millennia afterwards. You have a variety of very elaborate groundstone tools, some of which are included as grave goods. And then eventually you have a shift back to a predominance of flakestone artifacts, particularly at around between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago with the onset of the transitional Archaic and then the Maritime Woodland period. So I'm going to flip over this. I put this in here and then I'm realizing it's actually very hard to read a table like that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. But essentially, the onset of the Woodland period is characterized as around 3,000 years ago when you see the first evidence for indigenous pottery arriving in the region. You also have, during the early Woodland, not just the adoption of low-fired ceramics, so pottery. You have maritime groups interacting with groups throughout the eastern woodlands in what are called a series of different interaction spheres. And depending upon which terminology you use, there are Adena-like or Meadowood-like or Middlesex, but these are all sort of these cultural systems that are usually intersecting with burial ceremonialism, some of which is mound building. So for example, Adena-like components and others just sort of on shared artifact forms. And so the artifacts in the middle, for example, look very similar to meadowwood cache blades that you would expect to find in, for example, southern Ontario. They are just made on local material from northern New Brunswick. During the Middle Woodland, you have probably the best understood time period of the Maritimes. So alongside the proliferation of ceramic vessel technology, you have distinctive projectile point forms, so these bipointed styles like you see up at the top and the middle, and the beginnings of notched points that are probably an indication of changing technology. Maybe some of these smaller points might be the earliest forms of bow and arrow technology arriving in the region, certainly by later on. You have people settling into local landscapes, represented by both larger and continuously occupied sites. And generally what you see at this time period is, rather than these major exchange networks extending over most of the Northeast, you see Wabanaki groups kind of contracting a little bit and interacting more within watersheds and in amongst each other, which is kind of a change. You also have the establishment of coastal occupations and really intensively occupied coastal sites. And so on the top left there, you see a shell-bearing site or a shell midden. And so you have groups basically consuming shellfish, disposing of it, and creating sort of unique soil matrices that preserve organics in a way that we don't actually see in most of the Maritimes, right? So organic material gets destroyed by the acidic soil there, whereas on the coast, in these shell-bearing deposits, you actually have fantastic preservation. And so you can learn, part of the reason we know so much about the Middle Woodland is at this point you have shell-bearing sites that are preserving the kinds of organic material and other artifacts that we're not seeing in previous periods. Now, getting to the late Maritime Woodland. As we move through the Maritime Woodland toward the European contact, we start to see we can point to several shifts. First, people begin to emphasize the use of a series of waxy to glassy cherts, especially Minas Basin, stuff from Nova Scotia, and Wastomoic chert, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is from New Brunswick, as well as a chert from northern Maine called Munsungan chert, for tool production, and especially the production of small unifacial scrapers, and a sharp increase in the exchange of these exotic lithics all throughout the region. You see a dip in ceramic vessels, particularly after 1,000 years ago, to almost non-existent, possibly in part because we think that these are being replaced by perishable technologies like birch bark vessels and ash baskets and other vessels like that we're not seeing in the archaeological record due to preservation issues. So we're interpreting that those are happening just because the kind of stone tools that people are making at this time. Wabanaki groups also appear to be intensifying their behaviors in a variety of different ways, and we'll talk about this. Despite this, however, there's no indication that groups were practicing maize horticulture prior to European contact, suggesting that groups in this region eschewed a widespread woodland hallmark and persisted as hunting and fishing and gathering groups into the contact period. And while large village sites are rare on the Maritime Peninsula, at this time, Wabanaki may have been re-envisioning what a village actually looks like, and occupying whole landscapes as opposed to singular village locations, which has created some challenges for archaeology, as what we see are a proliferation of small, shallow, task-specific sites, which are notoriously hard to date, especially when the dates don't come back in time. So certainly by 1,300 years ago, and definitely in the period between about 1,000 years ago and 1500 CE in the Great Lakes, Iroquoian groups were organized into polities that stretched along the shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, lived in palisaded villages composed of longhouses of increasing size and internal complexity, and they grew and subsisted on maize and other domesticated crops, including rice, for example, along the north shores of Lake Erie. When Verrazano passed by New England, the New England coast in the early to mid-16th century, he noted it was highly populated and the presence of maize horticulturalists. And although there's considerable debate about the role that maize played for people in people's diets at the time, and whether pre-European groups were mobile farmers, as Elizabeth Chilton has argued, or arranged into what Alan Levely and colleagues have called dispersed villages, whereby villages need not be nucleated, much as they are in the Great Lakes, but could be a series of cooperative households that came together and dispersed, but for all intents and purposes functioned in much the same way. As Verrazano made his way up the coast, however, reaching northern New England and the Maritimes, he remarked, "They have no pulse, and we saw no signs of cultivation, nor would the land be suitable for producing any fruit or grain on account of this sterility." Despite this, about 50 years later, Champlain remarked that at Saco Harbor in sort of southwest Maine, he referred to, in a place he referred to as Shuacoat, he reports seeing cornfields and villages, which is much further up the coast than Verrazano reported. And although this references to this map on the right, Champlain may have been viewing space and the configuration of life at that time. It's not clear. So I have a colleague, Arthur Anderson, that's recently argued, like Levely and colleagues, that the picture of what Europeans viewed as villages and the use of those and the lives on the ground were a little bit different than what was actually going on. Now what we do see is in the late woodland increasing house floor size over time. So although they're not growing maize, we are seeing houses get bigger, which means there's probably a larger population and maybe more people living in each dwelling. This correlates with similar increases in house floors in areas where maize horticulture was being practiced, but is fairly distinctive in overall size. In coastal sites, there's really good archaeological examples of what are interpreted as wigwams, and these demonstrate patterning that shows continuities in the selection of site locations. Many were reused over successive generations, and increasingly, the late woodland, you see this proliferation of task-specific sites. This has led many to believe that what's happening in the late woodland is similar to what Levely discussed for New England, that Wabanaki were not just growing in population, but they were shifting toward more logistically mobile lifestyles with larger, likely seasonal summer aggregations located in key places throughout the landscape, some of which we know from the archaeological record, for example, in coastal Maine at a place called Goddard, and in Nova Scotia. There's speculation that if there are more formal villages from this time period, however, they may be located in places like Fredericton or St. John, where colonial towns and settlements took place and have actually destroyed or buried evidence of these larger village sites. We also see subsistence intensification. So at Birch Cove, a site in the southwest of the province, Jesse Webb reports in one excavation unit alone, so one by one, at least 2,200 individual specimens of tomcod, suggesting that fisheries in the late maritime woodland had become highly specialized, highly localized, and perhaps intensified with anthropogenic weir structures. So people are basically coming together at some of these possibly organized seasonally, to come together for these big fisheries, right? Whereas in coastal Nova Scotia, and likewise in the Passamaquoddy Bay area, we see a shift over time in the fraction of terrestrial mammals being consumed, so there's a larger volume of food over time. It's also the change in the diet itself. And a change in the kinds of and concentration of shellfish being consumed, possibly also a decrease in sea mammal concentration. Now, interior data from subsistence is sorely lacking. However, there's proxy information. For example, the increase in small scraping and graving tools could suggest an emphasis on fisheries, with small tools being particularly well suited for cleaning and processing fish. In terms of socio-political organization, there's increasing evidence to suggest that in the late pre-contact, as we see in the post-contact period, Wabanaki people are moving into heterarchical structures where there's flexible and kind of situational leadership situations. Some Wabanaki groups, so for example the Mi'kmaq, in the post-contact period appear to be more sociopolitically organized, and there's increasing evidence that this may have translated into a pre-contact period where local groups were controlled by a sagamore, or sort of a chief, and the different districts of Mi'kma'ki would come together under a paramount chief into some of these seasonal locations, right? And so in the post-contact period, there's larger structures that are described as being in Cape Breton, in Rishabukto in New Brunswick, and there's some suggestion that by the late woodland, there were these paramount chiefs that were acting to bring people together at particular moments, and you can imagine that that's probably happening around some of these major fishing and hunting exercises. So back to how this relates to big questions and what the work is that I'm doing. So lithic technology, and so like I said, in the interior, we have very little subsistence data to go on. And so a lot of what we know about what's going on among Wabanaki and the increasing sort of complexity of what's going on in the late woodland period is tied to how we understand patterning of stone tools, for example. In my work, it's lithics and exchange patterning. So we're going to shift focus here to the Lower Wolastoq and much of what we know in the stretch of river that extends from the head of tide in Mactaquac down to the reversing falls in the city of St. John before going into the Bay of Fundy. A lot of my work, like I said, has been centered in this Grand Lake Meadows area, and I spent a number of years working at Wabanaki Lake, which is the most southerly of these lakes, which characterize the north bank of the Wolastoq, which originates in the northeastern marshland. Along its eastern shore, there's a material of fine-grained material we call Wabanaki chert. So Wabanaki multicolored chert, as you can see here in the bottom right, and up on the top, embedded some of the bedrock outcrop. Very fine-grained material, has all sorts of different color ranges. It's hosted in limestone beds along the shore. There are a couple of major outcrops that extend for about 1,400 meters along the eastern shoreline and on the other side of what we call Bellier's Cove. And so together I refer to these as the Bellier's Cove Quarry. And so I've used the Wabanaki chert as a way to argue for how Wabanaki exchange relationships were changing through time, and in particular, what we're seeing in the late woodland period. So archaeological evidence relating to use of the quarry extends back as far as probably the Paleo-Indian period, at least with the chert. We don't think it's coming from the lake in the Paleo-Indian period, but most of the material that you're seeing made out of Wabanaki chert is from the Maritime Woodland period, so from about 3,000 years ago to about 500 years ago. During this period, there's an observable increase over time in the presence broadly of exotic lithic materials at regional archaeological sites, and this culminates in what we call a fairly substantial and widespread lithic exchange network during the late Maritime Woodland period. And so I've used this material as a way to interpret what's been described to some as the intensification of regional hunter-gatherer exchange systems, and the evidence for the establishment of traditional territories or the move toward a more sedentary lifestyle among Wabanaki. My findings, by tracking Wabanaki chert through the landscape, indicate that throughout the Lower Wolastoq, throughout the early and middle woodland periods, there's really fairly discrete clusters of particular materials and technological choices being made. But by the late Maritime Woodland, the assemblage that the database that I built up, there's the largest number of components with Wabanaki chert contained in them. It's the broadest distribution of Wabanaki chert, so it extends out for several hundred kilometers away from the quarry. And I think this possibly reflects the changing ways that Wabanaki groups were interacting with one another, and what I also think might be the increasing importance of places in the landscape, like, for example, Bellier's Cove. The data generally indicate a pattern of distance decay, so that is, the largest concentrations of Wabanaki chert are located within 20 kilometers of the quarry. They kind of drop off from there. There is, however, a second peak of sites between about 100 and 150 kilometers from the source, encompassing areas of eastern New Brunswick, the Passamaquoddy Bay area, and the key locations where we suspect Wabanaki people were coming together, possibly at particular times of the year. There's not just a larger number of sites with Wabanaki chert, again, kind of as a proxy for site distributions. There's a larger volume of the material moving around, which suggests that maybe there is more activity going on in the quarry, and it's becoming an increasingly important place to visit. The appearance of Wabanaki chert in finished and raw forms at places like these villages like Goddard in coastal Maine, or at the Melanson village in Nova Scotia, suggests that it factored into the types of trades taking place at these socially important gathering places. It's also interesting to see that in the assemblages that are more than 50 kilometers away from Wabanaki Lake, you have very few projectile points, but you also have 63 thumbnail scrapers. And so what it looks like is these small stone tools, these small scraping tools, are actually being traded almost exclusively from different locations to different locations. This suggests that not only is there greater volume of Wabanaki chert circulating, but there were particular classes of artifacts, so for example these small unifaces, that had become important to produce on the material when it was available. There's evidence too that modification of Wabanaki chert may have been infused with ritually and important places at this time. So heat treating, for example, appears, and Wabanaki chert appears in the fill material from the Adena site at Metapanagia. There are also two possible contexts of caching of the material. Along the eastern shore of Wabanaki Lake, The picture on the bottom there's a cache of quartz projectile points. All 8 points are nearly identical in shape and form, including one made on Wabanak chert. Further, there's a pinkish-hued chalcedony point made on Wabanak chert. It's this one here, these ones here, that are among a suite of projectile points found at the Skull Island burial site, or that are very similar to the ones found at the Skull Island burial site. They follow a distinctive shape and size. They have straight blade margins and narrow, deep corner notching. And Adrian Burke has observed these and noted that the standardization in form probably had a symbolic dimension or was connected in some way to group identity among the Wabanaki. It's also interesting to note that at this time, you start to see patterning in the distribution of different styles of projectile points. And so above that sort of artificial line that Adrian proposes, you never see triangular points. You only see notched points in that area, whereas you see an increasing number of triangular points the further to the southwest you get, which again is kind of indicating, kind of roughly follows along what we may be seeing are sort of the beginnings of kind of traditional territories of, for example, Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq peoples. So, part 2, Wabanaki in the post-contact world. Generally, what we start to see is we see a continuation in trade networks that were existing in the pre-contact period into the post-contact. There's a site that we found, for example, on the shores of Wabanak Lake, where there's a focus on reduction and preparation of bifacial tools and bipolar tools, as well as historic material from the 18th century in association with it. You're also seeing changes in settlement location despite technological throughputs. So houses look the same, tools look the same, but Wabanaki people are changing where they're actually placing their houses. And so Devil's Head in coastal Maine, the pre-contact components are located in one location, whereas the post-contact one is in between and may be actually favorably located for a better view of the entrance to the St. Croix Harbor, possibly for the purpose of intercepting Europeans at that time for negotiations that we know were going on between Wabanaki and Europeans. At the site called Swan Creek Lake, which dates to probably the 18th century, we see essentially a toolkit that looks identical to what you would expect to see in the Late Maritime Woodland, but it's continuing on into the post-contact period. The arrangement of this space is very similar to sites that we see, wigwam structures that we see in the pre-contact period. And what's very interesting is that these late woodland, post-contact, and ethnographic Wabanaki wigwams all seem to have an arrangement of space that is very similar, right? And so we have ethnographic evidence that suggests that the way that Wabanaki built and maintained their houses, the internal structure of them actually stayed very similar. And so why is this important? It looks like there are marked continuities in the structure of domestic space, even in the post-contact period, where there is evidence, at least from the coast, that Wabanaki were changing where they were living. And this continues on into the historic period, where you see a variety of different structure types among the Wabanaki. So, shifting now to some of the work that I'm doing as part of this last part of the talk, I'm going to introduce Fulton Island. And so this is an intact, fairly stratified site that was excavated back in the 1970s. Fulton Island does have a late maritime woodland component, none of which are dated. We just don't have a good sense of what it looks like. Everything from about 1500 cal BP onward at the site, usually in the top 50 to 60 centimeters, is glossed by what Ellen Folks has referred to as the post-ceramic, indicating, for example, that there were no indigenous ceramics recovered after a certain depth. This is not unsurprising. There are very few ceramics in the late woodland, and at the time Folks did her thesis in 1980, following the excavations in the early 1970s, there was relatively poor chronological control. The purpose of the excavation was really to build chronology and information about subsistence, build chronology tied to pottery, so that we understood the cultural historical record in the area a little bit better. And while Folks' analysis was comprehensive and descriptive of the ceramics and lithics, Susan Blair's work took this a little bit further and built a chronology surrounding features that suggested over time Fulton Island's features and complexes became more increasingly more complex. I took this work on in my master's thesis, and it was meant to build on sort of what the previous people had done and kind of follow this through to the late woodland. I thought that Fulton Island in particular might be a place where we'd see evidence of these large summer aggregations in the late woodland. Due to its location on the river, it would make it ideal for seasonal fishing and particular constriction. There were also corner-notched and side-notched points, pretty characteristic of the late woodland. In the end, I found myself a little bit over my head, and although I did note there appeared to be a preference for non-local materials for scraping tools, I didn't get a whole lot further with the Fulton Island stuff there. What I've discovered is that there's a basically undescribed component at the site where stone tools, including flakes and gunflints, were recovered in association with European goods, suggesting that Wolastoqey were continuing to live on the island into the post-contact period. There's also the site at Ekpahog, and this was identified by archaeologists in the 1980s. Surface collected, there appear to be pottery dating to between about 2200 and 1800 years ago. But there's evidence, despite there's evidence back to 2200 years ago, this place is still an important gathering place for Wolastoqey, and certainly was in the 18th century. Gani Uten was likely one of the most important sites for gathering and counseling among Wolastoqey, and it's noted that Ekpahog, as the site is sometimes referred to, encompasses several islands, including what was described as an old village on the island and on the shoreline in the 18th century. What's really important is that this place was a place where differences and disputes would be settled, and there's historical references of upwards of 40 or so wigwams and a large council house, which archaeologically we might call a longhouse. And so there's a couple of places in the Lower Wolastoq that look like they could be very important for understanding this late woodland and post-contact period. And so this is where the Lower Wolastoq Erosion Project comes in. So the purpose of this is to assess, evaluate, and develop comprehensive mitigative strategies regarding the impact of climate change on the archaeological record. Risks to Indigenous communities and culture have been identified as key messages and climate threats for Atlantic Canada. And there's estimates that current and future coastal and inland erosion of archaeological sites will cause serious political and cultural implications for Wabanaki people. Although the erosional impacts to ancestral Wabanaki sites have been noted since the 1960s, they remain an ongoing and an increasing threat. So one of the things that we proposed to do over the last couple of years, working with the Wolastoqey Nation, is to assess the known inventory of archaeological sites in the Lower Wolastoq. And so this is basically picking up with surveys from the 1970s, looking to see whether we can relocate those sites, whether they are actively eroding, or if we can't even detect that they're there anymore. That's one part of it. Using a variety of different desktop methods, and we're also looking at doing some remote sensing work as well. The next part is to conduct some targeted survey at actively eroding or threatened sites, or sites that are identified by Wolastoqey community members, and implement mitigative testing and or excavation of these sites, in particular looking for ones that can inform have research potential. The last part, one of the last parts of this is to use data from survey and excavation to answer these critical research questions about Wolastoqey lifeways during the late maritime woodland and into the post-contact and historic periods. And part of the reason that we're doing this is to build a better understanding of what's going on. We have a pretty good sense of where people are up to about 1600 years ago. We have a very poor understanding of the period afterwards, and in particular, there is not a single documented post-contact site that is dated to that time period or has been described as a post-contact Wolastoqey site in the entire Lower Wolastoq, even though we know that people were living there well into the 20th century. And the purpose of this overall is that we'll work with the community and using survey data to inform the development of a community-led long-term management plan for how you address the impacts of climate change. So we set out in 2024 to start this work. A crew of a recent graduate student from University of New Brunswick, as well as Wolastoqey community members. What we found is that at sites, for example, like Fulton Island, so this is the island right there, and the variety of registered pre-contact sites, there are hundreds of artifacts eroding out, and these cover a fairly long time period, including the late woodland. And so what we see here are diagnostic artifacts from the early woodland period. We've got a box-based metawood point there, a bi-point that's probably middle woodland in age, some groundstone tools that are probably transitional archaic in age, a projectile point on the right side there that is very likely, from the earliest occupations that we know of from the site around 3,200 years ago, as well as that brown speckled thumbnail scraper made on material from Nova Scotia that is likely associated with the late woodland period. And so this is the stuff that's eroding out from Fulton Island. We also went to Ekbehag, and you can see here that not only are there artifacts eroding out, one of the first sites that was registered in the 1980s is now located between about 100 and 200 meters off the shore, the present-day shoreline of the island. And so this is just below the Mactaquac hydroelectric dam, and so this has a couple of different things working against it. One is that you have increasing storm frequency and amplitude. Spring freshet is more intense, but you also have the hydroelectric dam, the spill gates opening up more. And so when you have these more intensive storm events and large flood events, you have a much higher volume and pace of water that's passing by this island. So the southwest corner of it is kind of getting torn apart. We've discovered 2 new sites in the last couple of years of survey out there, indicating that there are not just pre-contact sites. So we know that there's sites dating back to around 5,500 years ago on this island. There's also what appears to be a historic component along the south shore of the island where we're recovering historic ceramics in association with stone tools, indicating probably a post-contact Wolastoqiyik component that is eroding out actively. So we've gone back this year and we started some excavation work. The arrow is pointing to the location of a test unit that we excavated this year. Again, we did some shoreline survey, recovered over 250 artifacts over the course of 2 days, dating again pottery from between about 2,500 to about 1,500 years old, a variety of stone tools, a ton of fire-cracked, or as you guys called it here, fire-broken rock, indicating that there are like large, probably hearth features that are eroding out, projectile points and bifaces, as well as some really interesting finds. So again, this projectile point is probably about 3,200 years old, and so some of the earliest components of the site are eroding out, as well as some of the more recent stuff. So there's like historic material that's coming out from the farmers that lived on part of the island. So sort of a map of the excavations that took place in the 70s, showing the location of where we did our test units. And the purpose of these was to identify whether or not we could find an intact late woodland or post-contact component. The goal of some of this is to go back and date these sites. So the radiocarbon dates I'm waiting for are from a variety of these late woodland sites and a couple of potential candidates for post-contact sites to get radiocarbon dates associated with them to build more robust chronology, so we actually understand a little bit better about what's going on with technology. And then at Fulton Island, it's taking advantage of what we know to be a stratified archaeological site and trying to unpack and identify features and artifacts that date to this post-contact and late woodland period. So we started with one end of the island, which was very promising until we opened up the units, and about like 5 centimeters in, they were flooded with water. We did get a little bit farther on what we came down on, and like I said, I thought I was going to be sharing with you. You can see there's a tiny little spot here, some carbonized wood that we recovered, and a couple of features, a large number of stone tools, capped by about 25 centimeters of silt, so in really kind of ideal conditions coming out of that work. I think it could be late woodland, it could be post-contact, I have no idea, but I'll send the ASA an update when I when I get the feedback on that. And so, like I said, I was going to come up with some kind of like bigger insights into what I'm seeing out there and kind of how this all this picture comes together. But the fact of the matter is we don't really know how many of these sites that we've identified as late woodland as post-contact. We don't know how far apart they are in time, right? And so we have a good sense that groups start making these notched projectile points about 1500 to 1600 years ago. But we also have pretty good evidence that those notched projectile points are being made 200 or even 300 years ago, well into the European contact period. We know that small scraping engraving tools, and so really beautiful materials from throughout the region are being used in the late woodland, and we also see that stuff being made in the post-contact period. What's really fascinating is at Fulton Island, there are gunflints made on the same materials that people are making scrapers out of, right? And so there are all sorts of interesting things going on that we just don't have a really good sense of how this stuff fits together. And so part of this project is to unpack that puzzle and put Wabanaki back in the landscape. What's really important about this project is that this is being led by the community, right? And so I have research goals with this, but all of the work was developed in consultation with Wolastoqey Nation in New Brunswick. The crew is almost exclusively Wolastoqey. My co-director for the project, Ramona Nicholas, is a Wolastoqey archaeologist who's also a water grandmother and elder. And so we're kind of redoing the way that we've always done archaeology, right? We're rethinking the way that we're approaching field work. We do a smudge, we do a prayer before we go out in the field, we drop tobacco every morning. Ramona and the crew, you know, they're talking, one of the things was really interesting is they were talking in Wolastoqey and they were saying that bringing the language back to the artifacts is really important. And then they're starting to find things, right? And so one of the crew members, Aurora, is starting to become a language speaker. And she one day mentioned, she said that I think what we're doing out here is, you could call it Nolunge Zoldiban, which translates to taking care of each other, right? And it wasn't just us taking care of each other by making sure everybody had water and food and things like that. It was the philosophy of taking care of the archaeological record, and that Wolastoqey are now basically making decisions for how they want to view and how to manage their heritage. And so part of the project and the research goals are to put Wolastoqey back in the landscape in a period of time where we don't have a really good sense of where they are. And it is being done by Wolastoqey as well. And so I'll leave it off there, and like I said, if we get some interesting information, like I'll get an email, I'm sure, from Lalonde tomorrow with all of these dates, but thank you.